Hey guys, a rainy day in a medieval village sounds peaceful at first, almost cozy from a distance. But for the people who lived through it, rain was not just weather. It was mud under the door, smoke that would not rise, animals growing restless, tools rusting, fields becoming dangerous, and a whole village quietly adjusting itself around water. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to drift into next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating journeys into the past. So let us step carefully into a medieval village on a rainy day, not as a painting, not as a fantasy, but as a real place where every drop of rain changed the rhythm of ordinary life. The first thing to understand is that rain in a medieval village was rarely just background. It touched nearly everything. It changed how people walked, how they worked, how they cooked, how they slept, how they worried, and how they measured the fragile distance between comfort and hardship. A modern viewer might imagine a rainy day as a pause, a day indoors, a day of rest, perhaps, with the sound of water on a roof and a fire burning warmly nearby. But in a medieval village, especially in Northern and Western Europe, rain often made life more difficult rather than more restful. It did not stop work entirely. It rearranged it. It pushed some tasks indoors, delayed others, spoiled a few, and made many more unpleasant. The village itself would have looked different in the rain. Not dramatically different, perhaps, but heavier, softer at the edges. The thatched roofs would darken as they absorbed moisture. Earthen lanes would turn from firm paths into sticky mud, cut by cartwheels, hoof prints, and the repeated footsteps of villagers moving between cottages, barns, wells, gardens, and fields. Smoke from hearths might hang lower in the damp air, drifting slowly rather than rising cleanly. The smell of wet straw, manure, wood smoke, soaked wool, and damp earth would settle over the settlement. This was not a world built to resist weather in the modern sense. It was a world built to live with it. Most medieval villagers did not live in stone castles or picturesque cottages with glass windows and dry floors. Their homes varied by region, wealth, and century, but many were modest timber, wattle and daub, clay, turf, or stone structures, roofed with thatch, reeds, shingles, or other local materials. A poorer household might live in a single-room dwelling shared closely with tools, stored food, children, and sometimes animals nearby or under the same roof. The floor might be beaten earth, scattered with rushes or straw, and in wet weather that floor could feel cold, uneven, and faintly damp. Rain could test a house in quiet ways. A roof did not need to collapse to become a problem. It only needed to leak above a sleeping place, drip near stored grain, soak bedding, or soften part of a wall. A thatched roof, if well maintained, could shed water surprisingly well. But that was the key phrase, well maintained. Thatch required attention. The ridge could weaken. Birds could disturb it. Wind could open small gaps. A neglected roof could let the weather in slowly, drop by drop. And those drops mattered. In a medieval household, keeping things dry was not a small domestic preference. It was a matter of survival. Grain could mold. Straw could rot. Clothing could become difficult to dry. Firewood could smoke instead of burn. Bedding could grow unpleasant and unhealthy. A tool left too long in damp conditions could suffer. In a home where nearly every useful object took labor to make, repair, or replace, moisture was an enemy that entered politely and stayed too long. The hearth, often the center of the home, became even more important on a rainy day. It gave warmth, light, a place to cook, a way to dry small things, and a sense that the household still had control over its immediate world. But the fire was not always the glowing comfort that modern imagination prefers. Damp fuel could smoke heavily. Ventilation was limited. Chimneys, where they existed, were not universal in the early and high medieval countryside. Many homes relied on smoke finding its way through a roof opening, a louver, or gaps in the structure. On a wet day, the inside of a cottage could be dim, smoky, and close, while garments might hang near the warmth, slowly steaming. Shoes or pattens might be scraped clean as best they could be. Children might be warned away from the fire. Someone might stir a pot, mend a garment, twist fiber, repair a tool handle, sort seeds, patch a basket, or do the endless small work that kept a household alive. This is one of the first quiet reversals of the rainy medieval day. Bad weather could bring people indoors, but indoors did not necessarily mean leisure. In a peasant household, there was almost always work that could be done under shelter. Rain did not create free time so much as shift the burden from the field to the house. Women's work, especially, often became more visible in such conditions, though medieval records rarely preserve it with the fullness it deserves. Food preparation, child care, dairy work, brewing, spinning, mending, tending poultry, managing stored goods, and keeping the household functioning all continued. A rainy day could concentrate these tasks into a smoky interior, where space was limited and privacy almost non-existent. Spinning is worth pausing over because it was one of the great background labors of medieval life. Cloth did not simply appear. It required fiber, preparation, spinning, weaving, finishing, and repair. The simple image of someone working with a distaff or spindle beside a hearth is not decorative. It represents hours and hours of necessary labor. Rain might make fieldwork difficult, but it could also mean more time spent on the slow creation and maintenance of textiles, which were among the most valuable possessions ordinary people owned. Clothing itself shaped the rainy day. Medieval villagers were not walking about in bright festival costumes every day. Most wore practical garments made from wool, linen, leather, and whatever their means allowed. Wool had advantages in wet weather because it could retain warmth even when damp, but soaked wool was heavy, uncomfortable, and slow to dry. Cloaks, hoods, caps, and simple outer coverings helped, but no one was truly waterproof in the modern sense. Footwear mattered too. Leather shoes could suffer badly in mud and wet ground. Wooden pattens, overshoes, or clogs might help lift the foot above filth and moisture, especially in towns, but village paths still became difficult. Mud was not just inconvenient. It carried manure, animal waste, rotting vegetation, and everything else that lay in the lanes. To cross the village in the rain was to move through a mixture of earth and daily life. The village animals felt the weather as well. Chickens sought shelter. Pigs rooted in wet muck. Cattle and sheep might need to be managed carefully depending on the season and landscape. Horses or oxen, if a household had access to them, were too valuable to neglect. Wet weather increased the work of keeping animals fed, contained, and protected from illness or injury. A slippery yard, a broken fence, a flooded ditch, or a lame animal could become an immediate concern. And then there were the fields. The medieval village was not separate from its fields. It existed because of them. Rain could be blessing or threat depending on timing, intensity, season, and soil. This is one reason we should be careful with simple statements about medieval people loving or fearing rain. Farmers needed rain. Crops required it. Pastures depended on it. Wells and streams were sustained by it. A dry season could be far more frightening than a wet afternoon. But too much rain or rain at the wrong time could be disastrous. In spring, rain might soften the soil for plowing, but persistent wetness could delay sowing. In summer, it could flatten grain or encourage disease. At harvest, rain could be deeply troubling because cut grain needed to dry. If the crop was ready and the sky turned wet for days, the village could feel a rising anxiety that was practical, not dramatic. Grain in the field was food, rent, seed, tax, and survival. A rainy harvest was not merely inconvenient. It threatened the year ahead. On an ordinary rainy day outside the harvest season, fieldwork might slow but not vanish. Some tasks could continue in poor weather. Animals still needed attention. Ditches might need clearing. Fences needed checking. A common field system required coordination, and individual households were bound into wider obligations. The manor, the church, neighbors, kin, and customary rites all shaped what could be done and when. This is where the medieval rainy day becomes more than atmosphere. It becomes a window into a system. A village was not simply a cluster of cottages. It was a network of labor, obligation, memory, rights, and survival strategies. Many villagers held land under customary arrangements. They might owe labor services, rents in money or kind, dues at the mill, fees for certain rights, and tithes to the church. The rain did not wash away these obligations. It made them harder to meet. Imagine a man or woman looking out at rain with a calculation running quietly in the mind. Which task can wait? Which cannot? Is the path to the mill passable? Is the roof holding? Is the stored grain safe? Are the animals sheltered? Will the Lord's work still be expected? Is there enough dry wood? Has the stream risen? If the rain continues, what happens tomorrow? Medieval life was not lived as constant panic. People were accustomed to hardship in ways that modern comfort can make difficult to imagine. But accustomed does not mean indifferent. A rainy day could bring resignation, irritation, relief, worry, and routine all at once. The sounds of the village would change. Rain on thatch is softer than rain on tile or slate, a thickened whisper rather than a sharp tapping. Water might drip from eaves into puddles below. Carts would move with a heavier sound, wheels sucking through mud. Animals would call from sheds or yards. A door might open and close quickly to keep out the damp. Inside, the crackle of the hearth might be mixed with the hiss of wet wood and the cough of someone bothered by smoke. The light would be poor. Glass windows were rare in many rural homes for much of the Middle Ages. Openings might be covered with shutters, oiled cloth, horn, or simple wooden fittings depending on means and region. On a rainy day, keeping out weather meant sacrificing light. A home could become dim even at midday. Work that required seeing closely, such as fine sewing, sorting, or repair, would be done near the fire or doorway when possible. This dimness matters because medieval time was partly shaped by light. Artificial lighting existed, of course, but candles were not casually wasted by poorer households. Rushlights, lamps, and firelight could help, but each had a cost in materials, effort, or smoke. A rainy day shortened the useful brightness of the day. It made the interior world narrower. And still, food had to be prepared. The meal on such a day would depend heavily on region, season, and wealth. For many villagers, the daily diet leaned on bread, pottage, ale, vegetables, legumes, dairy when available, and occasional meat or fish depending on status, season, and local rules. Pottage is one of those humble foods that deserves more respect than it often receives. It could be thin or thick, plain or nourishing, made from grains, peas, beans, onions, leeks, herbs, greens, or whatever was available. On a rainy day, a pot over the fire offered warmth as much as food. Bread was central, but bread depended on grain, milling, baking arrangements, fuel, and local custom. Some villages used communal ovens. Some households baked at home where permitted and practical. If rain made movement difficult, even ordinary food routines became more burdensome. Carrying grain or dough through mud was not romantic. It was heavy, wet, and necessary. Ale also belonged to everyday life, not as a constant revel but as a common drink in many medieval communities, especially where water quality varied and brewing was a household or local activity. Brewing itself was labor-intensive and often associated with women's work. Wet weather could affect fuel, storage, and movement, but it did not suspend the daily need for drink. If the rain fell on a fasting day or during a church season with dietary restrictions, the menu might shift again. The medieval calendar was not merely a way of counting days. It structured work, rest, food, ritual, and expectation. A rainy Friday was not exactly the same as a rainy feast day, a rainy Sunday, or a rainy harvest morning. The church bell, if the village had one close enough to hear, helped shape the day's rhythm. Prayer, obligation, and weather met in the same muddy lanes. The parish church itself might stand as the most solid building in the village, though not always grand. In rain, its stone or timber form could seem even more permanent beside the softer cottages around it. The church was spiritual center, social marker, meeting place, record keeper, and sometimes refuge of a sort, though not a refuge from all hardship. People might pass it on their way to tasks, glance toward the churchyard, or hear the bell through damp air. Rain also changed the social texture of the village. In good weather, much work happened outdoors and in shared spaces. In rain, people might cluster under shelter, in barns, by hearths, near workshops, or at doorways. News could still travel. Complaints could still be exchanged. A neighbor might ask for help patching a roof, moving an animal, or retrieving something from a flooded patch of ground. In small communities, privacy was limited, and mutual dependence was not sentimental. It was practical. Yet rainy days could also sharpen tensions. If a boundary ditch overflowed, whose responsibility was it? If animals broke loose, who suffered damage? If a path became nearly impassable, who repaired it? If someone failed to perform expected work because of weather, would others accept the excuse? Medieval village life required cooperation, but cooperation lived alongside resentment, hierarchy, gossip, and dispute. This is another place where the familiar image of the simple, harmonious village becomes too neat. Medieval villagers were not merely passive figures in a pastoral scene. They negotiated, argued, sued, borrowed, lent, helped, resisted, remembered insults, and depended on one another. Rain could reveal the strength of community, but also the pressure points within it. For children, a rainy day might have been both confining and fascinating. Childhood in the medieval countryside was not modern childhood. Children worked from an early age in ways appropriate to their size and ability. Watching animals, gathering fuel, helping with younger siblings, carrying water, scaring birds from crops, assisting in household tasks. Rain could keep smaller children near the hearth, where the crowded interior made patience necessary. Older children might still be sent out if the task mattered enough. They would learn the weather not as scenery, but as instruction. Which clouds meant trouble, which paths flooded, which roof corner leaked, which animal disliked thunder, which ditch was dangerous, which adult became anxious when the rain came at harvest. Knowledge was absorbed through repetition, correction, and necessity. A rainy day in winter was different from one in spring, and both differed from rain in late summer. In winter, wet cold could be miserable. Snow has a certain visual drama, but cold rain can be more penetrating. It soaks clothing, chills hands, and turns paths treacherous without the clean brightness snow sometimes brings. In a poorly lit home with damp fuel and limited bedding, winter rain could make the day feel long and physically heavy. Spring rain could carry hope and frustration together. Promise growth but delayed movement. It softened fields but could drown seedlings. It filled ditches and renewed pastures but made plowing difficult if the soil became too wet. Medieval agriculture depended on intimate timing, and rain was part of that timing, never simply good or bad. Summer rain might be welcome after dryness, but if it came with storms, hail, or long gray stretches near harvest, the mood could change. And autumn rain, after the main harvest, might turn roads difficult just when rents, dues, markets, and preparations for winter mattered deeply. Roads deserve special attention because a rainy day made the village's connection to the wider world more fragile. Medieval roads varied enormously. Some were remnants of older routes, some were local tracks, some were better maintained near towns or important estates, and many were simply beaten paths across fields and commons. Rain exposed their weakness. Cart could become stuck. A bridge could be unsafe. A stream crossing could rise. Travel that seemed easy in dry weather became slow and uncertain. This mattered for markets. A village was not always as isolated as popular imagination suggests. People went to markets, mills, courts, churches, fairs, and neighboring settlements. Goods moved, news moved, labor moved, but rain could slow all of it. A villager planning to carry eggs, cheese, cloth, vegetables, or small goods to market might reconsider if the road became too poor. A delay of one day might be minor. A series of delays could matter. The mill was another point where rain could be both friend and problem. Watermills depended on water, but excessive rain could swell streams, damage works, complicate access, or interrupt normal operation. In many manorial systems, peasants were required to use the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. That meant milling grain was not simply a technical task. It was embedded in power. On a rainy day, the path to the mill, the condition of the stream, the availability of the miller, and the obligation to have grain ground all came together. Even mud had a politics. Who maintained the lane? Who had rights of passage? Who could collect wood? Who controlled access to common land? Who owed labor for repairs? Who had the better house site on slightly higher ground? And who lived where water gathered? The landscape of a village was never neutral. It reflected wealth, custom, age, power, and compromise. A household with more resources might endure rain with fewer immediate consequences. Better roofing, more stored fuel, more spare clothing, stronger animals, servants or hired help, and better access to carts or barns could soften the day's discomforts. A poorer household had less margin. One leak, one spoiled sack, one sick animal, one lost day's labor could matter more. This is why the rainy medieval day is such a useful subject. It reveals inequality without needing a battle or a king. It shows the difference between those who could absorb inconvenience and those who lived closer to the edge. And yet, it would be wrong to imagine villagers as helpless victims of weather. They were skilled at managing the conditions of their world. They knew how to thatch, patch, drain, store, preserve, mend, improvise, and endure. Their knowledge was local and practical. It lived in hands and habits rather than in formal manuals. A rainy day called on that knowledge constantly. Someone might check the roof from inside, listening for a new drip. Someone might move a basket away from a damp wall. Someone might turn stored hay or inspect a byre. Someone might lay straw where the yard had become too slick. Someone might repair a hurdle, sharpen a tool, twist rope, carve a peg, or sort beans by the doorway where a little light remained. The work was not heroic. That is precisely what makes it historically important. Most of history was lived this way, not as an event but as maintenance. People keeping things from falling apart. People making small adjustments before problems became disasters. People enduring discomfort without expecting anyone to record it. The medieval rainy day also reminds us how much human life depended on materials. Wood, clay, straw, wool, iron, leather, grain, water, dung, ash, and smoke were not background details. They were the substance of the world. When rain fell, each material behaved differently. Wood swelled, clay softened, straw soaked, wool grew heavy, iron rusted, leather stiffened or weakened, grain spoiled, ash turned paste-like, dung spread, smoke lingered. Modern life often hides these material reactions behind sealed windows, paved roads, central heating, treated fabrics, electric light, and indoor plumbing. Medieval villagers lived much closer to the visible behavior of things. They knew rain through touch, smell, weight, and consequence. By late morning, if the rain continued, the village would settle into its wet rhythm. People who had gone out would return with damp hems and muddy feet. The hearth would be fed cautiously if dry fuel was limited. Pot might thicken slowly. A child might be sent to fetch water despite the weather, because rain falling from the sky did not necessarily remove the need to bring usable water into the house. Someone might grumble over smoke. Someone else might listen for whether the wind was changing. And beyond the cottages, the fields waited. They were not passive scenery. They were the village's future, lying under the rain. Seed, root, blade, furrow, ditch, hedge, pasture, and path were all being altered by water. Some changes were welcome. Some were worrying. Some would not reveal their meaning for days or weeks. That uncertainty was part of medieval life. A rainy day did not always announce whether it was blessing or warning. It simply arrived, and the village had to answer it task by task, hour by hour as the afternoon approached. The question became less about whether the rain was unpleasant and more about what kind of day it was becoming. Was this a passing shower that would leave the fields refreshed? Or the beginning of a wet spell that would delay work, damage stores, and make every ordinary movement harder? For the people inside those low, smoky homes, the answer was not written in a forecast. It was read in the clouds, the wind, the stream, the mud, the animals, and the anxious memory of other rains that had come before. For many villagers, those memories mattered almost as much as the rain itself. Medieval people did not possess weather records in the modern sense, but they carried long histories in conversation and experience. An older farmer might remember the wet summer that spoiled grain decades earlier. A widow might recall a season when swollen streams cut off access to a nearby market. A laborer might remember a year when endless rain delayed planting until entire households worried about what would happen in winter. In a world where harvests could determine survival, weather was never merely discussed. It was interpreted. This is one reason medieval communities often appeared highly attentive to signs in nature. The flight of birds, the behavior of livestock, the direction of the wind, the appearance of clouds, the smell of the air before a storm. These observations were practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Not every belief was accurate, and not every prediction succeeded, but such observations formed part of a living relationship with the landscape. The mill was another point where rain could be both friend and problem. Watermills depended on water, but excessive rain could swell streams, damage works, complicate access, or interrupt normal operation. In many manorial systems, peasants were required to use the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. That meant milling grain was not simply a technical task. It was embedded in power. On a rainy day, the path to the mill, the condition of the stream, the availability of the miller, and the obligation to have grain ground all came together. Even mud had a politics. Who maintained the lane? Who had rights of passage? Who could collect wood? Who controlled access to common land? Who owed labor for repairs? Who had the better house site on slightly higher ground? And who lived where water gathered? The landscape of a village was never neutral. It reflected wealth, custom, age, power, and compromise. A household with more resources might endure rain with fewer immediate consequences. Better roofing, more stored fuel, more spare clothing, stronger animals, servants or hired help, and better access to carts or barns could soften the day's discomforts. A poorer household had less margin. One leak, one spoiled sack, one sick animal, one lost day's labor could matter more. This is why the rainy medieval day is such a useful subject. It reveals inequality without needing a battle or a king. It shows the difference between those who could absorb inconvenience and those who lived closer to the edge. And yet, it would be wrong to imagine villagers as helpless victims of weather. They were skilled at managing the conditions of their world. They knew how to thatch, patch, drain, store, preserve, mend, improvise, and endure. Their knowledge was local and practical. It lived in hands and habits rather than in formal manuals. A rainy day called on that knowledge constantly. Someone might check the roof from inside, listening for a new drip. Someone might move a basket away from a damp wall. Someone might turn stored hay or inspect a byre. Someone might lay straw where the yard had become too slick. Someone might repair a hurdle, sharpen a tool, twist rope, carve a peg, or sort beans by the doorway where a little light remained. The work was not heroic. That is precisely what makes it historically important. Most of history was lived this way, not as an event but as maintenance. People keeping things from falling apart. People making small adjustments before problems became disasters. People enduring discomfort without expecting anyone to record it. The medieval rainy day also reminds us how much human life depended on materials. Wood, clay, straw, wool, iron, leather, grain, water, dung, ash, and smoke were not background details. They were the substance of the world. When rain fell, each material behaved differently. Wood swelled, clay softened, straw soaked, wool grew heavy, iron rusted, leather stiffened or weakened, grain spoiled, ash turned paste-like, dung spread, smoke lingered. Modern life often hides these material reactions behind sealed windows, paved roads, central heating, treated fabrics, electric light, and indoor plumbing. Medieval villagers lived much closer to the visible behavior of things. They knew rain through touch, smell, weight, and consequence. By late morning, if the rain continued, the village would settle into its wet rhythm. People who had gone out would return with damp hems and muddy feet. The hearth would be fed cautiously if dry fuel was limited. Pot might thicken slowly. A child might be sent to fetch water despite the weather, because rain falling from the sky did not necessarily remove the need to bring usable water into the house. Someone might grumble over smoke. Someone else might listen for whether the wind was changing. And beyond the cottages, the fields waited. They were not passive scenery. They were the village's future, lying under the rain. Seed, root, blade, furrow, ditch, hedge, pasture, and path were all being altered by water. Some changes were welcome. Some were worrying. Some would not reveal their meaning for days or weeks. That uncertainty was part of medieval life. A rainy day did not always announce whether it was blessing or warning. It simply arrived, and the village had to answer it task by task, hour by hour as the afternoon approached. The question became less about whether the rain was unpleasant and more about what kind of day it was becoming. Was this a passing shower that would leave the fields refreshed? Or the beginning of a wet spell that would delay work, damage stores, and make every ordinary movement harder? For the people inside those low, smoky homes, the answer was not written in a forecast. It was read in the clouds, the wind, the stream, the mud, the animals, and the anxious memory of other rains that had come before. For many villagers, those memories mattered almost as much as the rain itself. Medieval people did not possess weather records in the modern sense. but they carried long histories in conversation and experience. An older farmer might remember the wet summer that spoiled grain decades earlier. A widow might recall a season when swollen streams cut off access to a nearby market. A laborer might remember a year when endless rain delayed planting until entire households worried about what would happen in winter. In a world where harvests could determine survival, weather was never merely discussed. It was interpreted. This is one reason medieval communities often appeared highly attentive to signs in nature. The flight of birds, the behavior of livestock, the direction of the wind, the appearance of clouds, the smell of the air before a storm. These observations were practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Not every belief was accurate, and not every prediction succeeded, but such observations formed part of a living relationship with the landscape. On a rainy afternoon, conversation might naturally drift toward these matters. A visitor sheltering in a cottage could speak of conditions in another village. Someone returning from a nearby town might bring reports of flooded roads or damaged bridges. News traveled slowly by modern standards, yet information still moved continuously through networks of markets, churches, kinship ties, and local travel. A rainy day often compressed these exchanges into smaller spaces. Imagine entering a village workshop while rain tapped steadily overhead. Perhaps it belonged to a carpenter, a cooper, a smith, or another craftsman serving local needs. The workshop would not fall silent simply because the weather had turned poor. In some respects, rain created opportunities for certain forms of work. A carpenter could continue shaping wood beneath shelter. A cooper might repair barrels. A basket maker could continue weaving. A smith, protected by walls and roof, might find that villagers suddenly had time to bring damaged tools for repair. The medieval blacksmith occupies a particularly interesting place in popular imagination. Modern portrayals often present him as a muscular figure standing dramatically before a roaring forge. The reality was both less theatrical and more important. Villages depended heavily upon iron tools, nails, fittings, horseshoes, hinges, knives, agricultural equipment, and countless small metal objects. The smith's work helped sustain the entire local economy. Rainy weather sometimes highlighted this dependence. A broken plowshare might be noticed while work slowed. A damaged blade finally received attention. Equipment neglected during busy weeks could be repaired while field labor became less urgent. Again, the rainy day reveals something easy to miss. Medieval life was not divided neatly between work and non-work. It was a constant balancing of different kinds of labor. When one task became impossible, another often moved forward. Meanwhile, outside the workshops and cottages, water continued reshaping the village itself. Drainage was one of the hidden concerns of medieval settlement. Many villages occupied sites chosen over generations because they offered reasonable access to water while avoiding the worst flooding. Yet even favorable locations had vulnerable areas. A poorly drained lane could become a channel of mud. A depression in the ground could fill with standing water. A ditch neglected for too long might overflow into adjoining land. Standing water carried risks that villagers understood well, even if they explained them differently than modern science would. People recognized that stagnant conditions often accompanied illness, foul smells, and unhealthy environments. Their explanations varied according to local beliefs, religious ideas, and contemporary medical theories, but the practical observation remained. Wetness lingering where it should not linger was generally unwelcome. The medieval understanding of health itself adds another layer to the rainy day. Most people interpreted sickness through frameworks very different from modern medicine. Learned physicians often drew upon ancient traditions associated with humoral theory, while ordinary villagers combined practical remedies, inherited knowledge, religious belief, and local custom. Rain could fit into these understandings in complex ways. Cold dampness was frequently associated with discomfort and vulnerability. A person soaked through after hours outside might worry about more than temporary misery. Wet clothing, chilled limbs, and prolonged exposure seemed capable of upsetting the body's balance. Whether or not the explanations matched modern science, the observations were rooted in experience. Working outdoors in cold rain genuinely could leave people exhausted, weakened, and susceptible to illness. This helps explain why keeping warm mattered so much. A dry cloak, a functioning hearth, a supply of fuel, and shelter from wind were not luxuries. They formed part of a household's defense against a world that could become physically dangerous through accumulation rather than catastrophe. Not every rainy day brought hardship. Sometimes rain arrived gently and steadily, nourishing crops without disrupting life too severely. Sometimes villagers welcomed it after weeks of dryness. But medieval people rarely had the luxury of assuming that favorable conditions would continue indefinitely. Uncertainty shaped their relationship with nature. That uncertainty becomes particularly visible when we consider food storage. Many viewers imagine medieval hunger primarily as the result of dramatic famines. Those events certainly occurred and could be devastating. Yet long before famine appeared, households devoted enormous effort to protecting supplies from countless smaller threats. Moisture was among the most persistent. Grain stored improperly could spoil. Hay damaged by moisture could become unusable. Root vegetables required careful management. Salted foods depended upon storage conditions. Cheese, butter, dried peas, beans, and other provisions all required attention. A rainy day often prompted inspections. Someone might quietly examine a storage chest. Another might check sacks hanging from rafters. A farmer could visit a barn simply to reassure himself that the roof remained sound. Such actions may seem mundane, but they reflected a larger reality. Medieval survival depended heavily upon preserving abundance when it existed. The distance between security and insecurity could be surprisingly narrow. A modern supermarket restocks continuously through complex supply chains. A medieval village relied much more heavily upon what had already been gathered, preserved, protected, and stored. When villagers worried about rain, they were often worrying about future months as much as the present day. This becomes especially apparent if we imagine the afternoon progressing toward evening. The light grows dimmer. Rain still hangs in the air. The pathways remain muddy. Smoke drifts low above rooftops. Inside homes, attention gradually shifts from daytime labor toward the preparations required before darkness. Darkness itself deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of medieval life. Modern societies have largely conquered darkness through electric lighting. Medieval communities had not. Night remained a powerful presence. People certainly moved after sunset when necessary, but darkness imposed practical limits. Rain intensified those limits by reducing daylight even further. On a gloomy afternoon, evening seemed to arrive early. Tasks requiring travel might be postponed until morning. Household routines adjusted accordingly. Livestock needed checking before visibility faded. Water might be collected while there was still enough light to walk safely. Firewood had to be brought inside. Doors and shutters would be secured. Each small action contributed to a sense of preparedness. This preparedness was rarely dramatic. It resembled countless habits learned through repetition. One reason historical documentaries sometimes struggle to portray medieval life accurately is that they focus heavily on extraordinary events. Kings, wars, rebellions, and famous disasters naturally leave records. Yet most people spent most of their lives managing ordinary risks. Rain reminds us of that. A leaking roof could matter more to a family than a distant political dispute. A spoiled grain store might have more immediate consequences than a royal marriage. The great events of history certainly influenced villages, but daily life was often experienced through much smaller concerns. As afternoon deepened, children might become restless indoors. Elderly family members could settle near the warmest part of the hearth. Someone might continue spinning by fading light. Someone else could repair harness straps or mend a damaged garment. Storytelling likely occupied some of these hours. It is difficult to know precisely what stories circulated in every village, but we know that oral traditions played an enormous role in medieval culture. Tales of saints, local legends, family histories, cautionary stories, seasonal customs, and fragments of larger narratives passed from person to person across generations. Rain created conditions favorable to listening. Before widespread literacy, listening held a different place in society than it does today. Information, entertainment, memory, and instruction often arrived through spoken words. A rainy evening gathered people into shared spaces where stories naturally flourished. This does not mean every cottage became a cheerful scene of communal storytelling. Fatigue remained real. Work remained demanding. Yet conversation itself was an important resource. Through conversation, knowledge survived. A young person learned which fields flooded first. A newly married couple learned household practices. Children absorbed family history. Neighbors exchanged practical advice. Season after season, such exchanges helped communities adapt. Religion also occupied these conversations and reflections. Medieval Europe was deeply shaped by Christianity, though expressed differently across regions and centuries. Rain could be viewed through spiritual as well as practical lenses. Some might see favorable weather as a blessing. Extended hardship could encourage prayers, processions, or appeals to particular saints associated with protection, agriculture, or local traditions. Modern audiences sometimes assume medieval people separated practical reasoning from religious belief less clearly than today. In many cases that is true, yet it would be a mistake to imagine them as choosing between faith and practicality. Most villagers used both. A farmer could inspect drainage ditches while also praying for favorable weather. A household might repair a roof while attending religious observances. The spiritual and practical worlds overlapped constantly. As evening approached, another subtle transformation occurred across the village. Noise diminished. Rain often creates a sense of enclosure. Sounds beyond a certain distance fade into the background. Activities that required movement across open spaces become less common. Gradually, the village contracts inward. Doors close. Animals settle. Fires burn lower or brighter depending on available fuel. The world beyond the immediate circle of light grows harder to see. Yet beyond that darkness lay larger forces already shaping the future. Roads connected the village to nearby towns. Towns connected to regional markets. Markets connected to kingdoms. Kingdoms connected to trade routes stretching across Europe and beyond. Even a humble rainy day in a small village existed within wider systems of economics, politics, climate, and culture. Most villagers rarely perceived those systems in their entirety. They experienced them through taxes, prices, rents, obligations, shortages, opportunities, and occasional visitors arriving with unfamiliar news. And sometimes, during periods of unusual weather, those larger systems became impossible to ignore, because there were years when rain stopped being an inconvenience, years when it became a crisis, years when streams overflowed repeatedly, roads failed, crops struggled, and entire regions felt the consequences. To understand what a rainy day truly meant in medieval life, we eventually have to move beyond a single village and consider what happened when wet weather persisted not for hours or days, but for seasons. For now, however, evening is settling across the village. The rain continues. A few final tasks remain unfinished. Someone steps outside carrying a lantern-like light. Another listens carefully to the sound of water running through a nearby ditch. A farmer glances once more toward the dark outline of the fields, trying to judge whether tomorrow will bring clearer skies or another day of uncertainty. And in that quiet moment, standing between the security of home and the unpredictability of the wider landscape, we begin to see how deeply weather shaped not just medieval work, but medieval expectations themselves. And in that quiet moment, standing between the security of home and the unpredictability of the wider landscape, we begin to see how deeply weather shaped not just medieval work, but medieval expectations themselves. The expectation that tomorrow might not resemble today was woven into village life more thoroughly than many modern people realize. A rainy evening did not simply encourage someone to wonder whether they should carry an umbrella in the morning. It could raise questions about crops, livestock, travel, obligations, and resources that extended months into the future. As darkness settled more fully across the village, the rain often became easier to hear. During the day, sound competed with movement. Carts rattled over rough ground. Animals called from fields and yards. Voices carried between cottages. Tools struck wood and iron. But at night, many of those sounds faded away, leaving the steady rhythm of water more noticeable. Inside a modest peasant home, a family might gather around the remaining light of the hearth. The fire would rarely be allowed to blaze wastefully. Fuel represented labor. Every branch collected, every bundle of brushwood gathered, every piece of timber cut and dried required effort. A household that wasted fuel in autumn might regret it deeply by winter. The management of fuel is one of those overlooked realities that rain immediately brings into focus. Dry wood does not appear automatically. It must be collected, transported, stored, protected, and rationed. A prolonged wet period could make all of those tasks more difficult. Even if a family possessed enough firewood, keeping it dry became an ongoing challenge. Wood stacked against an exterior wall might absorb moisture. Branches left uncovered could become unsuitable for immediate use. Smoke from damp fuel could fill a room with irritation and discomfort. In some regions, people supplemented wood with peat, turf, brush, or other locally available fuels. Each had advantages and disadvantages. Each behaved differently in wet conditions. The result was that a rainy day often extended its influence into the evening meal itself. Cooking over an open hearth required attention under the best circumstances. Heat distribution was uneven. Pots had to be monitored. Fuel consumption mattered. Smoke was a constant companion. Rain complicated these routines because it affected the materials upon which the entire process depended. And yet, despite these difficulties, the evening meal often represented an important moment of stability. No matter how uncertain the weather might be, households still gathered around food when possible. The details varied enormously. A relatively prosperous household might enjoy a thicker pottage, better bread, more dairy products, perhaps some preserved meat or fish. A poorer family might eat something simpler and less abundant. But the act itself mattered. Eating reinforced family bonds, household hierarchy, shared responsibility, and routine. Routine was one of the great defenses against uncertainty. Historians sometimes focus on dramatic moments because they are easier to identify in surviving records. Yet, for ordinary people, much of resilience came from repeated habits. The same tasks performed day after day created a sense of continuity even when external conditions changed. A rainy day, therefore, reveals an interesting paradox. The weather was unpredictable. The response to the weather often was not. People had learned, through generations of experience, what needed to be done. The roof must be checked. The fuel must be protected. The animals must be secured. The grain must be watched. The tools must be maintained. The paths must be negotiated carefully. The work shifted, but life continued. This practical adaptability was one of the reasons medieval villages survived for centuries despite recurring hardships. Of course, survival did not mean comfort. If we could step inside many rural homes after nightfall, one of the first things we would notice would be how crowded they often felt. Modern expectations of personal space would not easily fit the realities of many medieval households. Sleeping arrangements varied according to wealth and circumstance. Some families possessed proper bedsteads with mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or other materials. Others slept on simpler bedding laid close to the hearth or against walls. Multiple family members often shared sleeping spaces. Privacy existed, but in forms quite different from those familiar today. Rain intensified this closeness. When outdoor activities diminished and darkness arrived early, more time was spent together in confined interiors. Children, parents, grandparents, servants, laborers, and visitors might all occupy the same limited space. This could foster cooperation. It could also create tension. One of the more realistic aspects of medieval life that often disappears from romantic portrayals is the simple challenge of living closely with other people. Disagreements happened. Personalities clashed. Children became restless. Neighbors annoyed one another. Families worried about resources. Rain did not create these tensions, but it could make them harder to avoid. At the same time, close living arrangements encouraged forms of community that modern societies sometimes lack. Knowledge passed easily between generations because generations frequently shared the same physical spaces. A child listening beside the hearth might hear discussions about crops, weather, rents, local disputes, religious observances, seasonal preparations, and family history all within a single evening. Education in the medieval countryside often occurred this way, not primarily through books, not primarily through formal instruction, but through participation. Knowledge was embedded in daily life. A young boy learning to manage livestock or a young girl learning household responsibilities was not usually separated from the practical realities of adult work. They observed, they assisted, they absorbed information gradually through involvement. Rainy evenings created opportunities for such learning. An elder explaining why a particular field drained poorly. A parent describing how to recognize spoiled grain. A neighbor recounting the consequences of an especially wet year decades earlier. These conversations helped preserve local memory. Local memory, in turn, helped communities navigate uncertainty, because weather was never experienced in isolation. Every rainy day was unconsciously compared with previous rainy days. Every season was measured against remembered seasons. This accumulation of experience formed a kind of practical archive carried in people's minds. Sometimes those memories extended beyond individual lifetimes. A village might collectively remember a flood, a destructive storm, a failed harvest, a disease outbreak associated with wet conditions. Stories of such events could survive for generations. In this sense, rain connected present experience with historical memory. A farmer looking anxiously at dark clouds might not simply be evaluating today's weather. He might be recalling stories told by his father or grandfather. He might be comparing current conditions to events that occurred years before his own birth. The landscape itself often reinforced these memories. Perhaps a certain low field always flooded first. Perhaps an old bridge had been rebuilt after earlier damage. Perhaps a particular stream crossing was known to become dangerous after prolonged rainfall. Such knowledge accumulated slowly, and because medieval communities tended to remain relatively stable across generations, that knowledge could become remarkably detailed. This continuity helps explain why villages often seemed deeply attached to particular places. Land was not merely property. It was memory, Every path, hedge, stream, and field carried associations. Rain activated those associations. A swollen ditch reminded people of previous storms. A muddy road recalled difficult journeys. A healthy crop after rainfall confirmed inherited wisdom about local conditions. The environment and the community were constantly interpreting one another. As the evening advanced, another important aspect of village life emerged: the relationship between weather and time itself. Modern people often think of time as something measured by clocks. Medieval villagers certainly possessed ways of marking time, but daily life was influenced much more directly by natural cycles. Sunrise mattered. Sunset mattered. Seasons mattered. Weather mattered. Rain altered the perceived shape of the day. A dark, wet afternoon could feel longer than a bright one. Tasks took more time. Movement slowed. Visibility decreased. Opportunities narrowed. The rhythm of work changed. These changes may seem subtle, yet over months and years they accumulated into meaningful differences. A farming society was constantly negotiating with nature's timetable, and nature rarely followed human preferences. This reality becomes particularly important when considering labor obligations owed to landlords or manorial authorities. Many medieval villagers did not possess complete freedom to organize their work exactly as they wished. Obligations varied widely across regions and periods, but labor services remained significant in many places. Rain introduced complications. If poor weather delayed certain tasks, villagers sometimes faced difficult decisions about priorities. Their own fields required attention. Obligatory labor might also require attention. These competing demands could create friction. The romantic image of medieval village life often overlooks these pressures. Yet they were part of daily reality. A rainy week could affect not only agricultural productivity but social relationships as well. Expectations had to be negotiated. Excuses had to be evaluated. Authorities had to decide how strictly obligations would be enforced. Weather therefore possessed social consequences alongside practical ones. Even religion intersected with these concerns. Church attendance remained important, but difficult conditions could affect travel. Local clergy frequently found themselves part of the broader conversation about hardship, community responsibilities, and divine providence. Rain was not simply observed. It was interpreted through moral, spiritual, economic, and practical frameworks simultaneously. This layered understanding is one reason medieval life often appears more interconnected than modern life. Few aspects of existence remained isolated from one another. Weather affected agriculture. Agriculture affected food. Food affected health. Health affected labor. Labor affected obligations. Obligations affected social relationships. Social relationships affected community stability. A single rainy day touched every part of the system, and sometimes, without anyone realizing it, a seemingly ordinary day marked the beginning of larger developments. A prolonged wet period might begin with weather that seemed unremarkable. The first day brought inconvenience. The second day brought annoyance. The third day raised concern. Only later did people recognize that something more significant was unfolding. This gradual escalation is another important lesson from medieval weather. Historical change often arrived quietly, not through sudden catastrophe, but through accumulation, water gathering in a ditch, mud deepening on a road, fields remaining saturated, travel becoming slower, stores facing greater pressure, small changes building upon one another. For the villagers settling into their homes on this particular rainy evening, none of that could yet be known with certainty. They knew only what lay before them. The rain continued. The fire burned. The animals rested. The darkness thickened beyond the walls. And somewhere beyond the village boundaries, Streams were already carrying the day's rainfall toward larger rivers, larger valleys, and larger landscapes, whose conditions would soon begin shaping the fate of communities far beyond a single cluster of cottages. Before dawn arrived, the weather would continue its quiet work across fields, roads, woodlands, meadows, and waterways, setting in motion consequences that most villagers could neither fully see nor entirely predict. And as the night deepened, attention gradually shifted from the sounds inside the cottage to the persistent sound outside. The rain still falling steadily across the medieval countryside, hour after hour, long after most of the village had finally fallen asleep, and as the night deepened, attention gradually shifted from the sounds inside the cottage to the persistent sound outside. The rain still falling steadily across the medieval countryside, hour after hour, long after most of the village had finally fallen asleep. For those who lived in the village, sleep itself was not always the uninterrupted experience modern people often expect. A rainy night could make the differences even more noticeable. Water dripping from a weak section of roof might wake a household. A restless animal in a byre could require attention. Wind accompanying the rain might rattle shutters, shift thatch, or drive moisture into places where it was not welcome. Most villagers did not retreat into perfectly sealed homes. They slept in buildings that remained connected to the outside world in countless small ways. The smell of damp earth could enter through gaps in walls. Cold air might slip beneath a door. The sounds of livestock remained close. Rain became part of the night's atmosphere rather than something entirely excluded from it. This constant connection to the environment shaped medieval experience in subtle ways. Modern homes often create a clear boundary between indoors and outdoors. Medieval homes blurred that boundary. A storm was not merely observed through a window. It was felt through temperature changes, sounds, smells, and practical consequences. As midnight passed, streams beyond the village continued to swell. The villagers sleeping in their cottages could not see this process, but it was occurring nonetheless. Rainwater falling on roofs quickly reached the ground. Water landing in fields seeped into soil or flowed into drainage channels. Small rivulets joined larger ones. Ditches fed streams. Streams fed rivers. Across an entire region, countless drops of water participated in the same movement. This larger hydrological story rarely appears in popular images of medieval life, yet it mattered enormously. The medieval village was not an isolated island. It was part of a landscape system. The condition of distant hills could influence local streams. Rain falling many miles away might eventually affect a river crossing near the village. Conditions upstream could determine whether a watermill functioned smoothly or faced difficulties. Nature connected communities long before roads did. By the darkest hours of the night, the rain might have become lighter, or perhaps heavier. Medieval villagers had no weather forecasts to provide certainty. They relied on observation, experience, and patience. Patience was an essential skill. Much of medieval life involved waiting. Waiting for crops to grow. Waiting for roads to dry. Waiting for livestock to recover. Waiting for markets. Waiting for favorable weather. Waiting for daylight. Rainy periods often reinforced this rhythm of waiting because many important outcomes could not be forced. A farmer could inspect a field repeatedly, but he could not command the clouds. A family could patch a roof, but they could not stop the storm. A miller could maintain his equipment, but he could not control the flow of water beyond certain limits. This balance between effort and uncertainty characterized much of rural life. People worked hard because hard work genuinely mattered. Yet they also lived with forces beyond their control. Rain was one of the most visible reminders of that reality. Eventually, somewhere beyond the clouds, dawn began to approach. The first hints of morning arrived gradually. Darkness softened. Shapes emerged. The outlines of cottages, trees, fences, and fields slowly returned to view. For villagers accustomed to living closely with natural light, these transitions carried more significance than they often do today. Morning was not simply another hour on a clock. It represented opportunity. Work could resume. Conditions could be assessed. Plans could be adjusted. The future became visible again. One of the first questions many villagers might ask upon waking would be simple. Is it still raining? The answer immediately influenced the day ahead. If the rain had stopped during the night, there might be cautious optimism. The ground would remain wet, but some activities could proceed. Paths might still be muddy, yet travel would become easier. Fields could begin draining. If the rain continued, calculations changed. Tasks would be reconsidered. Expectations adjusted. The village would once again reorganize itself around weather. This constant adaptation reveals something important about medieval intelligence. Modern audiences sometimes underestimate rural populations because formal education was limited. Yet surviving in an agricultural society required considerable practical knowledge. A successful villager understood soils, understood seasons, understood animals, understood tools, understood local geography, understood community obligations. Rain touched every one of these areas. Knowing how quickly a field drained, which route remained passable after heavy rainfall, or where livestock should be sheltered represented valuable expertise. Such knowledge was rarely written down. It lived in memory, and because it lived in memory, it was often transmitted through families and communities rather than institutions. A rainy morning, therefore, became a test of accumulated experience. The village elder might predict conditions based on decades of observation. A younger farmer might compare current weather with previous years. Households discussed options. Neighbors exchanged information. Collective understanding gradually emerged. This process reminds us that medieval villages functioned as information networks. Not formal networks, not bureaucratic networks, but networks nonetheless. News spread through conversation. Practical advice spread through observation. Warnings spread through reputation. Knowledge moved constantly between individuals. Rain often accelerated these exchanges because it created shared concerns. If a bridge became unsafe, people talked about it. If a stream flooded unexpectedly, people talked about it. If a section of road turned impassable, people talked about it. Weather generated information, and communities responded by sharing it. Now imagine stepping outside just after dawn. The rain has finally weakened to a fine mist. The village appears transformed. Puddles reflect the pale morning sky. Water hangs from thatched roofs in heavy droplets. The air smells fresh, earthy, and cool. Smoke begins rising once again from household hearths. Chickens cautiously emerge from shelter. Dogs investigate muddy pathways. People appear at doorways, surveying conditions. This moment often carried a certain tension. Not dramatic tension, practical tension. What exactly had the rain changed? The answer would reveal itself gradually. A farmer might walk toward his fields. Another might inspect fencing. Someone else could check drainage ditches. The miller might examine water levels. Each observation contributed to a larger assessment, and often the results were mixed. This is another aspect of medieval weather that modern narratives sometimes oversimplify. Rain was rarely entirely good or entirely bad. One field might benefit, another might suffer. One household's roof remained secure, another developed a leak. One road stayed usable, another became difficult. Experiences varied even within the same village. The complexity of these outcomes encouraged caution. Villagers learned not to celebrate too quickly or despair too quickly. They waited for evidence. Agriculture rewarded patience. Nature often punished assumptions. As the morning progressed, activity increased. Some people resumed outdoor work despite lingering dampness. Others focused on indoor tasks. The village gradually returned to motion. Yet the effects of the rain remained visible everywhere. Cartwheels left deep impressions in soft ground. Footpaths widened around muddy sections as travelers sought firmer footing. Standing water collected in familiar low spots. Animals tracked mud into yards and enclosures. These details mattered because they represented labor. Every muddy path eventually required maintenance. Every damaged fence required repair. Every drainage problem demanded attention. Rain generated work. Sometimes invisible work. Sometimes delayed work. But work nonetheless. This accumulation of maintenance helps explain why medieval communities invested so much effort into local infrastructure. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, fences, mills, and buildings all required constant care. A village that neglected these responsibilities became increasingly vulnerable. The relationship between rain and infrastructure becomes especially interesting when we consider bridges. A simple bridge could determine whether a community remained connected to neighboring settlements. If heavy rainfall damaged a crossing, trade slowed. Travel became difficult. Communication suffered. The consequences extended far beyond inconvenience. A traveler delayed by weather might miss a market. A merchant could arrive late with needed goods. News might reach a village days later than expected. Rain influenced not only movement through space but movement through time. Events unfolded at different speeds depending on conditions. This reality shaped medieval perceptions of distance. Today, distance is often measured in miles or kilometers. For medieval villagers, distance was frequently measured in effort. How long did it take to get somewhere? How difficult was the journey? How reliable was the route? Rain altered all three answers. A nearby market could suddenly feel farther away. A familiar road could become challenging. An ordinary trip could consume much more time than expected. These effects accumulated across entire regions. And when rain persisted for extended periods, the consequences expanded beyond individual villages. Food prices could change. Trade patterns could shift. Agricultural calendars might be disrupted. Political authorities sometimes became involved. Even religious observances could be affected by unusual weather conditions. What begins as a simple rainy day therefore opens a door into much larger historical questions. How resilient were medieval communities? How did they respond when ordinary weather became extraordinary weather? What happened when rain continued not for a day, or even a week, but across entire seasons? The answers lead us toward some of the most revealing episodes in medieval environmental history. But before reaching those larger developments, it is worth remaining for a little longer within the village itself. Because the ordinary response to rain is often more revealing than the exceptional one. A society's character is not shown only by how it handles disaster. It is shown by how it handles inconvenience. The medieval village managed inconvenience through cooperation, experience, routine, adaptation, and constant labor. That labor continued now as the morning advanced. Children carried out small tasks. Farmers moved carefully through damp fields. Women attended to household responsibilities that weather could not postpone. Craftsmen returned to workshops. Animals required feeding regardless of conditions. Life resumed, yet beneath that familiar rhythm lingered a quiet awareness. The rain had not simply passed through the village. It had altered the village. Some effects were visible. Others remained hidden. The soil held moisture beneath the surface. Streams carried additional water downstream. Roads bore fresh damage. Storage conditions required monitoring. Agricultural decisions would be adjusted accordingly. And as villagers gradually discovered what the storm had left behind, attention increasingly turned beyond individual cottages and toward the wider countryside, where neighboring communities were waking to the same wet morning and beginning their own assessments of what the rain might mean in the days ahead. And as villagers gradually discovered what the storm had left behind, attention increasingly turned beyond individual cottages and toward the wider countryside, where neighboring communities were waking to the same wet morning and beginning their own assessments of what the rain might mean in the days ahead. One of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining medieval villages is to picture them as isolated worlds. They were certainly more local than modern communities, but they were rarely cut off entirely. Even a modest settlement existed within a web of relationships stretching outward through roads, paths, rivers, markets, manors, monasteries, churches, and nearby towns. Rain moved through those networks just as people did. A muddy road in one village might delay a merchant carrying salt to another. A flooded stream crossing could alter travel routes. A damaged bridge might force traffic through neighboring settlements. The effects of weather rarely respected administrative boundaries. This broader perspective reveals something important about medieval life. While villagers often focused on immediate concerns close to home, their prosperity depended upon systems extending well beyond the horizon. A rainy day therefore possessed layers. At the most personal level, it meant wet clothing and muddy boots. At the household level, it meant protecting food, fuel, and shelter. At the village level, it meant evaluating fields, roads, and shared resources. At the regional level, it influenced trade, communication, and agricultural production. The same rain connected all of these scales simultaneously. As the morning advanced, travelers began appearing on the roads again. Not in large numbers. Travel remained difficult and often uncomfortable even under favorable conditions. But movement never stopped completely. Messengers carried news. Merchants transported goods. Clergy traveled between communities. Officials conducted business. Farmers visited markets. Families maintained connections with relatives living elsewhere. Rain altered these journeys in ways that modern transportation largely conceals. Imagine a traveler approaching the village after a night of steady rainfall. His pace would likely be slower. His clothing might be damp. The condition of his horse, cart, or pack animals would matter greatly. Every muddy section of road required additional effort. Every swollen stream demanded caution. A journey that normally consumed several hours might require considerably longer. This practical reality shaped medieval geography in subtle but important ways. Distance was elastic. Weather stretched or compressed it. A village 5 miles away might feel quite close during dry weather and surprisingly distant during prolonged rain. The landscape itself seemed to expand and contract according to conditions. For this reason, information often traveled unevenly. News did not move at a constant speed. A political development in a nearby town might reach one village quickly and another more slowly, depending partly upon roads and weather. Rain could therefore influence not only economic life but awareness itself. What people knew and when they knew it was shaped by environmental conditions. This becomes particularly interesting when considering markets. Market days represented vital points of connection in medieval society. They brought together farmers, craftsmen, merchants, laborers, clergy, and travelers from multiple communities. Goods changed hands. Information circulated. Relationships formed. A rainy market day was still a market day, but it was a different experience. Approaching roads became muddier. Animals required more careful handling. Perishable goods faced additional challenges. Attendance could fluctuate, yet market activity often continued because necessities could not always wait for better weather. This persistence illustrates another recurring theme in medieval life. People adapted because they had to. The modern option of postponing inconvenience indefinitely rarely existed. Food had to be sold. Supplies had to be purchased. Rent obligations had to be met. Tools required repair. Life continued despite discomfort. Perhaps this is one reason rain appears so frequently in medieval records, chronicles, and accounts. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it mattered. The weather influenced outcomes, and outcomes determined survival. As villagers resumed their routines, many of the day's activities would involve assessing moisture in places where moisture could become problematic. Barns provide an excellent example. Modern people often think of barns simply as storage structures. In the medieval world, they represented something more significant. They were protective barriers standing between agricultural abundance and agricultural loss. Hay stored improperly could deteriorate. Grain exposed to dampness could spoil. Animal fodder required careful management. The consequences of neglect might not become visible immediately. A problem unnoticed today could emerge weeks later. This delayed effect made rain particularly challenging. Its full impact was often hidden. A flooded field was obvious. A gradually spoiling grain supply was not. The most dangerous consequences of weather sometimes unfolded slowly. Medieval people understood this through experience. They learned to look for signs. They checked storage conditions. They inspected roofs. They monitored animals. They paid attention to subtle changes. This attention to detail formed part of everyday survival. And it helps explain why practical observation occupied such an important place in rural culture. Knowledge was earned through repeated encounters with reality. One generation passed lessons to the next, but those lessons gained authority because they proved useful. A farmer who ignored drainage patterns risked poor harvests. A household that neglected roof maintenance invited trouble. A traveler who underestimated weather conditions faced unnecessary danger. Experience taught caution. Rain reinforced it. By midday, if the clouds had begun to break, the village might reveal a quieter kind of beauty. This beauty deserves mention because medieval life was not composed entirely of hardship. Historical accuracy requires balance. The same rain that created inconvenience could also transform the landscape in ways villagers likely appreciated. Fields appeared greener. Streams sparkled with renewed movement. Dust disappeared from roads. Gardens revived. The air felt cleaner. Livestock benefited from refreshed pasture. Wells and water sources received replenishment. People living close to the land often recognized these advantages. The relationship between medieval communities and weather was rarely one of simple hostility. Rain was needed. The challenge lay in receiving enough without receiving too much. This balance sat at the heart of agricultural existence. In fact, one subtle misunderstanding modern audiences sometimes carry is the assumption that medieval people primarily feared rain. In reality, many feared drought just as much and sometimes more. A dry week could be welcome. A dry month could become worrying. A dry season could threaten disaster. Water was essential. The problem was unpredictability. This uncertainty created a constant tension between gratitude and concern. A rainy day could inspire both simultaneously. A farmer might welcome moisture for growing crops while worrying about delayed work. A miller might appreciate increased water flow while watching for damage to equipment. A traveler might enjoy replenished water sources while struggling through muddy roads. The same weather produced different consequences for different people. This diversity of experience reminds us that there was no single medieval perspective. Villagers shared certain challenges, but their circumstances varied. A landholding farmer experienced rain differently from a landless laborer. A miller experienced it differently from a shepherd. A widow managing a small household faced different concerns than a prosperous tenant. Even within one village, weather created winners and losers. Some households possessed greater resilience. Others lived much closer to vulnerability. Rain exposed these differences. Consider clothing once again. A relatively prosperous individual might own multiple garments, allowing wet clothing to dry while another set remained available. A poorer person often possessed fewer options. Remaining dry became harder. Recovery from bad weather took longer. Comfort depended heavily on resources. The same principle applied across countless aspects of life. Better roofs leaked less. Larger food stores offered greater security. Healthier animals provided more resilience. Additional labor reduced pressure. Rain therefore served as a kind of quiet test. Not a dramatic test, a practical one. How much inconvenience could a household absorb before difficulties became serious? For some families, the answer was quite a lot. For others, the margin was narrow. This reality helps explain why medieval communities frequently emphasized mutual aid alongside individual responsibility. Neighbors helped one another because circumstances often demanded it. A collapsed roof might require extra hands. A stranded cart might need assistance. Flooded property could create shared problems. Communal labor emerged partly from necessity. Rain reminded people of that necessity. As afternoon approached, village life settled into a new equilibrium. The immediate storm had passed. Its consequences remained, and now attention shifted toward interpretation. What did the weather mean? Would conditions improve? Would more rain follow? Were the fields benefiting or suffering? Should plans change? Such questions rarely had immediate answers. Patience once again became essential. In many ways, medieval agricultural life was an exercise in delayed understanding. Farmers planted long before they harvested. Decisions made today revealed their consequences weeks or months later. Rain participated in that process. A single wet day might matter very little. A pattern of wet days could matter enormously. Yet distinguishing between the two required time. This uncertainty encouraged a certain humility before nature. Not necessarily philosophical humility in the abstract. Practical humility. The recognition that outcomes depended upon factors no individual fully controlled. Even wealthy landowners confronted this reality. They might command labor. They might own extensive property. They might influence local politics, but they could not command the weather. Rain equalized certain vulnerabilities. Not completely. Resources still mattered. Yet nature imposed limits upon everyone. This truth became especially apparent during periods of unusual weather. And unusual weather did occur. Medieval Europe experienced years of excessive rainfall, years of drought, harsh winters, damaging storms, and unpredictable seasonal patterns. Some events affected only local areas. Others extended across entire regions. For ordinary villagers, these larger climatic episodes often began in deceptively ordinary ways. A wet week, then another. Fields remaining saturated. Roads staying muddy. Streams refusing to return to normal levels. At first, each development seemed manageable. Only gradually did a broader pattern emerge. This gradual emergence is one reason historical crises can be difficult to recognize while they are unfolding. People experience them day by day, not all at once. A rainy afternoon rarely announces itself as the beginning of a larger story. It simply arrives, and then another follows, and another. For now, however, the village remains in that intermediate space between event and interpretation. The storm has passed. Work continues. Questions remain unanswered. Across nearby settlements, farmers are making similar observations. Millers are watching water levels. Travelers are reporting road conditions. Clergy are hearing conversations about weather. Merchants are calculating delays. Slowly, information is accumulating. The countryside is taking measure of the rain. And as those observations spread outward through roads, markets, churches, and manorial networks, a larger picture begins to form. One that extends far beyond a single village and hints at how an ordinary rainy day could become part of a much wider medieval experience still unfolding across the landscape. And as those observations spread outward through roads, markets, churches, and manorial networks, a larger picture begins to form. One that extends far beyond a single village and hints at how an ordinary rainy day could become part of a much wider medieval experience still unfolding across the landscape. What makes this wider picture so interesting is that most villagers never saw it directly. A farmer standing at the edge of a wet field could observe his own land. He could inspect his drainage ditches, evaluate his crops, and discuss conditions with neighbors. But he could not easily know that dozens of villages beyond the horizon were making remarkably similar observations. This limitation shaped medieval understanding of the world. People experienced events locally, even when those events were regional. Rain might be falling across an entire county, a kingdom, or even a substantial portion of Europe, yet each community encountered it through its own fields, roads, and concerns. The broader pattern only emerged gradually through communication. A merchant arriving from another district might report flooded roads. A monk traveling between religious houses could mention unusually wet conditions elsewhere. A lord's steward might hear similar reports from multiple manors. Bit by bit, local experiences assembled themselves into something larger. This process reveals an important truth about medieval society. It was far more connected than it sometimes appears. Not connected in the modern sense of instant information. Connected through movement, connected through trade, connected through institutions, connected through shared dependence on the land. Rain served as a reminder of those connections because water itself ignored human boundaries. The stream passing near one village eventually became part of a river flowing through many others. The clouds crossing one field drifted over neighboring regions. The consequences of weather traveled. In some ways, the medieval countryside functioned like a vast conversation carried on through roads, waterways, and seasonal routines. And rainy periods often became common topics within that conversation. Imagine a weekly market held several days after a significant rainfall. People arrive from surrounding villages. Their clothing still bears traces of mud. Their carts move more slowly than usual. Conversations begin almost immediately. How are the roads? How high is the river? Did the bridge hold? Have your fields drained? Was the mill operating? The questions sound practical because they were practical. Yet they also served another purpose. They allowed communities to compare experiences. Through comparison, villagers learned whether a problem was local or widespread. This distinction mattered. A single flooded field might be unfortunate. Many flooded fields suggested something more significant. One damaged road was an inconvenience. Widespread transport difficulties affected trade and communication. The scale of a problem influenced how people responded to it. This ability to recognize patterns was one of the strengths of medieval communal life. Although formal scientific meteorology did not exist, people paid close attention to recurring relationships between weather and outcomes. Years of experience encouraged observation. Observation encouraged memory. Memory encouraged comparison. The result was a practical form of environmental awareness. People understood far more about local conditions than modern stereotypes sometimes allow. A village community might know exactly which meadow flooded first during prolonged rainfall. They might know how long it usually took certain fields to dry. They might know which roads remained passable under difficult conditions. This knowledge accumulated slowly across generations. And because life moved at a relatively measured pace, there was time to absorb it. Rain, therefore, reveals another subtle contrast between medieval and modern experience. Today, many people interact with nature through forecasts, maps, and technological systems that provide information at remarkable speed. Medieval villagers relied more heavily on direct observation. The sky mattered, the soil mattered, the behavior of water mattered, the appearance of plants mattered, the condition of animals mattered. Nature itself acted as an information source. This relationship could produce an intimacy with the landscape that is difficult for modern audiences to imagine. A farmer might recognize slight differences in soil moisture across neighboring plots. A shepherd could understand how weather affected grazing conditions. A miller paid close attention to water flow. A woodcutter noticed changes within forests after extended rain. Their livelihoods depended upon such awareness. This does not mean medieval people possessed perfect knowledge. Far from it. Nature remained unpredictable. Mistakes occurred. Assumptions failed. Unexpected events disrupted expectations. But daily survival encouraged attentiveness. And rainy weather rewarded attentiveness more than most conditions. Water revealed weaknesses. A leaking roof exposed neglected maintenance. A flooded path revealed poor drainage. A struggling crop exposed agricultural vulnerabilities. Rain functioned almost like a quiet inspection. Tested systems. Most of the time, those tests remained manageable. Villages expected occasional difficulties. The true challenge came when ordinary problems accumulated. A muddy road on its own was not disastrous. A muddy road combined with delayed planting, spoiled fodder, damaged fencing, and transportation difficulties created a more serious situation. Medieval people understood accumulation because they lived with it constantly. Life rarely changed through single dramatic events. It changed through the gradual piling up of consequences. This pattern appears clearly when examining labor. Consider the work required after a rainy spell. Paths might need repair. Drainage ditches required clearing. Animals demanded extra attention. Tools exposed to moisture needed maintenance. Stored supplies required inspection. Each task was manageable. Together they consumed time and energy. This hidden labor often disappears from popular portrayals of history. The dramatic moments attract attention. The maintenance work remains invisible. Yet maintenance was one of the central activities of medieval life. Entire communities devoted enormous effort to preserving what they already possessed. A house standing through winter. A bridge remaining functional. A field remaining productive. A mill remaining operational. These achievements depended upon constant care. Rain reminded people of that reality because it accelerated wear and tear. Wood rotted faster when damp. Roads deteriorated more quickly. Structures weakened. The environment continually pushed against human efforts to create order. Village life represented an ongoing negotiation with those pressures. And often that negotiation succeeded. One reason medieval villages endured for centuries is that people became remarkably skilled at adaptation. They adjusted, improvised, repaired, modified, learned. The image of medieval peasants as passive victims of circumstance overlooks this resilience. Certainly, hardships existed. Resources were limited. Unexpected disasters occurred. But villagers also possessed practical competence developed through generations of experience. Rainy weather offers a useful lens because it highlights both vulnerability and adaptability at the same time. The village could not prevent rain, could respond to rain. That distinction mattered enormously. As days passed following a storm, Attention increasingly shifted from immediate inconvenience toward longer-term implications. Would planting schedules need adjustment? Would travel remain difficult? Would stored fodder remain dry? Would local streams return to normal levels? Many of these questions lacked immediate answers. Patience once again became essential. Patience is perhaps one of the least appreciated historical skills. Modern life often encourages rapid feedback. Medieval life frequently did not. Agriculture required waiting. Weather required waiting. Construction required waiting. Travel required waiting. Rain reinforced this rhythm by slowing processes even further. Fields could not be rushed into drying. Roads could not instantly recover. Streams followed their own timetable. Nature moved at its own pace. Human plans adjusted accordingly. This adjustment often shaped social relationships as well. When conditions became difficult, cooperation gained importance. Neighbors might share information. Families exchanged assistance. Communal labor addressed shared problems. The medieval village was not always harmonious. Conflicts existed. Disputes occurred. People argued. Yet difficult conditions frequently revealed the practical value of cooperation. A damaged bridge affected everyone. A blocked drainage channel threatened multiple properties. A flooded route disrupted an entire community. Collective solutions emerged because collective interests existed. Rain therefore illuminates the social dimension of village life just as clearly as the environmental one. People depended upon one another, not constantly, not perfectly, but significantly. This interdependence helps explain why reputation mattered so much. A reliable neighbor possessed value. A skilled carpenter possessed value. An experienced farmer possessed value. Local knowledge represented a form of wealth. Communities remembered who could be trusted during difficult periods. Rainy weather often provided opportunities for such reputations to strengthen or weaken. Who helped repair the damaged road? Who shared useful information? Who fulfilled obligations despite inconvenience? These actions were noticed. Village memory could be remarkably long. And because communities remained relatively stable, reputations sometimes persisted for years as the countryside continued assessing the effects of recent rain. Another aspect of medieval life gradually comes into view: the role of seasonal timing. The exact same rainfall could produce very different reactions depending on when it occurred. Rain during planting season raised one set of concerns. Rain during harvest raised another. Rain during winter posed different challenges entirely. Timing often mattered as much as quantity. This reality complicates simple assumptions about medieval weather. People were not merely asking whether it was wet. They were asking whether it was wet at the right moment. Agriculture depended heavily upon timing. Fields needed preparation. Seeds required planting. Crops required harvesting. Livestock followed seasonal rhythms. Every task occupied a place within a larger annual cycle. Rain interacted with that cycle constantly. A rainy day, therefore, cannot be understood fully without considering the calendar surrounding it. And this is where our seemingly ordinary village begins to reveal something larger. Because the villagers examining muddy paths and damp fields are not only responding to today's weather. They are quietly measuring its relationship to the season itself. They are asking whether the rain belongs, whether it arrived when needed, whether it stayed too long, whether it hints at further changes ahead. Some of these questions will prove reassuring. Others may become more troubling. For now, however, the answers remain uncertain. The clouds continue moving across the countryside. Streams continue carrying water through valleys. Roads continue drying or failing to dry, according to local conditions. Messengers continue traveling. Markets continue gathering information. The landscape itself is still responding to what has fallen from the sky. And across dozens of villages connected by shared weather and shared concerns, people continue watching, comparing notes, and waiting to see whether this recent rain represents nothing more than a passing interruption, or the beginning of a pattern that will shape the weeks still to come. And across dozens of villages connected by shared weather and shared concerns, people continue watching, comparing notes, and waiting to see whether this recent rain represents nothing more than a passing interruption or the beginning of a pattern that will shape the weeks still to come. That waiting is perhaps the most difficult part for us to fully appreciate. Modern weather forecasts allow us to look ahead with remarkable confidence. We can see incoming storms, estimate rainfall totals, and make plans accordingly. Medieval villagers lived without that certainty. They knew what the sky looked like today. They knew what it had looked like yesterday. Beyond that, the future remained largely hidden. This uncertainty gave weather a different emotional texture. Rain was not simply experienced. It was anticipated, interpreted, and remembered. A cloud bank appearing on the horizon carried more significance when no forecast existed to explain it. The direction of the wind mattered. The appearance of the dawn sky mattered. The behavior of birds mattered. Even seemingly small observations could influence expectations. As a result, many medieval people developed an attentiveness to environmental details that feels unfamiliar today. Imagine a farmer crossing a field in the early morning. He notices that the ground remains softer than expected. Water still stands in a low depression. The stream bordering the meadow has not fallen overnight. None of these observations provide certainty, but together they suggest a possibility. The landscape is speaking, not literally, of course, but it is offering clues. And medieval life required learning how to read them. This ability to interpret local conditions was often more valuable than abstract knowledge. A villager who understood how rain behaved on nearby land possessed information with immediate practical value. He knew which areas dried first, which tracks remained usable, which grazing grounds became hazardous after prolonged wet weather. This knowledge was not dramatic. It was useful, and usefulness often mattered more than anything else. One reason rain occupies such an important place in the history of rural life is that it exposed the practical foundations of society. A kingdom might be governed by kings and nobles. A village survived through competence. The people living there needed food, shelter, fuel, tools, animals, and functioning relationships with their neighbors. Rain touched every one of those necessities. Even something as simple as collecting water reveals this complexity. At first glance, rain might seem to solve water problems automatically. Water is falling from the sky after all. Yet obtaining usable water remained a daily task. Wells had to be maintained. Containers had to be carried. Water sources had to remain accessible. Heavy rain sometimes complicated these routines rather than simplifying them. Paths became slippery, streams turned muddy, containers became harder to transport. A village's relationship with water involved far more than rainfall alone. The same was true for sanitation. This is an area where popular imagination often swings between extremes. Medieval villages are sometimes portrayed as impossibly filthy places, while romantic depictions ignore unpleasant realities altogether. The truth sits somewhere between those extremes. Villagers understood the value of cleanliness in practical terms, even if their methods differed from modern expectations. They swept homes, managed waste, maintained livestock areas, and attempted to keep living spaces functional. Rain created both challenges and opportunities. It could wash away certain accumulations. It could also spread mud, manure, and debris through roads and yards. Once again, the outcome depended heavily on timing, location, and intensity. A gentle rainfall might refresh the village. A prolonged wet spell could create persistent problems. The distinction mattered. As the days following the storm continue, another layer of medieval life becomes visible: the relationship between weather and social status. Rain fell on everyone. Its consequences did not. This difference is important. A lord residing in a substantial manor house experienced rain differently from a tenant farmer living in a modest cottage. A prosperous merchant experienced it differently from a laborer who depended upon daily work. Nature created common challenges. Resources determined how easily those challenges could be absorbed. Consider roofing. A well-constructed roof offered protection, comfort, and peace of mind. A poorly maintained roof created anxiety with every storm. The difference was not merely architectural. It affected sleep, health, food storage, and daily routines. The same principle extended to clothing. Extra garments provided flexibility. Additional livestock provided security. Larger stores of grain provided resilience. Every resource created a buffer against uncertainty. Rain therefore acted as a quiet reminder of inequality. Not in a dramatic political sense. In a practical one. Two families might watch the same storm from neighboring properties while experiencing very different levels of concern. One household worries about inconvenience. The other worries about consequences. This distinction appears repeatedly throughout medieval history. Yet it would be a mistake to assume that wealth removed uncertainty entirely. Even powerful landowners remained dependent upon agricultural success. Their incomes often derived from land, rents, and production. Poor harvests affected them too, though usually in different ways. This shared dependence on nature created a curious form of connection across social classes. People occupied very different positions within society. They still watched the same skies. And in agricultural communities, the sky mattered. The medieval calendar itself reflected this dependence. The year was structured around recurring tasks: plowing, sowing, haymaking, harvesting, preparing for winter. Each activity occupied a specific place within the cycle. Rain interacted with all of them. A modern office worker may notice weather mainly as a matter of comfort or convenience. Medieval villagers encountered it as part of the framework organizing their lives. The calendar was agricultural before it was numerical. A season mattered more than a date. This perspective becomes especially clear when examining the village's response to changing conditions. People rarely asked whether rain was pleasant. They asked whether it was timely. Was it helping crops? Delaying work? Threatening stores? Supporting pasture? Damaging roads? Its value depended on context. This contextual thinking made medieval weather remarkably complex. There were few simple answers. A rainy week could be good news for one household and bad news for another. A shepherd might welcome conditions that frustrated a grain farmer. A miller might appreciate water levels that troubled travelers. Different occupations produced different perspectives. The village contained all of them simultaneously. This diversity of experience is one reason historical reality often feels more interesting than stereotypes. The familiar image of medieval peasants reacting uniformly to weather misses the richness of actual life. People negotiated conditions according to their specific circumstances. The weather was shared. The consequences varied. As information continues circulating through nearby settlements, another aspect of medieval life comes into focus: risk management. Although the phrase sounds modern, the practice is ancient. Villagers constantly attempted to reduce exposure to uncertainty. They stored grain, maintained buildings, preserved food, managed livestock carefully, diversified certain activities when possible. These actions were not random habits. They represented accumulated strategies for dealing with an unpredictable world. Rain tested those strategies. A household's preparations became visible during difficult conditions. Was enough fuel stored? Had the roof been maintained? Were supplies protected? Were animals adequately sheltered? The answers emerged gradually. And because medieval people lived close to the limits of available resources, preparation mattered greatly. A small oversight could become significant. At the same time, it is important not to exaggerate hardship. One of the more surprising realities of studying medieval villages is discovering how normal much of life remained. Even during challenging weather, people adapted. Children played. Work continued. Meals were prepared. Conversations happened. Relationships developed. The rain changed conditions, but it did not stop life. This resilience deserves attention because it challenges a common assumption. Medieval people were not constantly overwhelmed by their environment. They were accustomed to it, not comfortable with every difficulty, not immune to hardship, but familiar with uncertainty in ways that modern societies sometimes are not. A rainy day was not an extraordinary event demanding extraordinary responses. It was part of life. The extraordinary situations emerged only when ordinary weather patterns persisted beyond their expected limits. And that distinction is crucial, because the difference between a manageable inconvenience and a serious crisis was often a matter of duration. One wet day rarely threatened a village. Several weeks might. This brings us back to the importance of observation. Villagers were not merely watching today's conditions. They were watching for patterns. Patterns mattered more than individual events. A single flooded ditch could be ignored. Repeated flooding could not. A delayed journey might be forgotten. Repeated delays affected trade. A damp field might recover. Persistent saturation created larger concerns. Gradually, communities learned to distinguish temporary disruptions from meaningful trends. This process required patience, memory, and communication. All three were deeply embedded in village life. The local church played a role. Markets played a role. Families played a role. Travelers played a role. Information moved slowly, but it moved continuously. And with each passing day, more observations entered the collective conversation. Road conditions here. Water levels there, crop conditions elsewhere, small reports accumulating into broader awareness. This gradual construction of knowledge is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval society. People rarely possessed complete information. They assembled understanding piece by piece, much like the landscape itself recovering after rain. Puddle dries, a stream recedes, a road hardens, a field drains. Changes occur incrementally. The human understanding of those changes develops incrementally as well. And so, while daily life resumes its familiar rhythm, attention remains quietly fixed on the weather. Farmers continue looking toward the sky. Millers continue monitoring water. Travelers continue reporting conditions. Across the countryside, observations accumulate. No one yet knows exactly what story these observations will tell, but the process has already begun. What seemed like a single rainy day is gradually revealing itself as part of a larger sequence of events, one measured not in hours but in weeks, and one that will increasingly draw the village's attention beyond immediate concerns toward the broader patterns emerging across the medieval landscape. What seemed like a single rainy day is gradually revealing itself as part of a larger sequence of events, one measured not in hours but in weeks, and one that will increasingly draw the village's attention beyond immediate concerns toward the broader patterns emerging across the medieval landscape. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember as we finally leave this village behind. At the beginning of our journey, a rainy day may have sounded like a simple subject. Quiet day, an ordinary day, the sort of day that disappears into the background of history. Yet history is often hidden in precisely those ordinary moments. The rain falling on a medieval roof was never just rain. It was a test of craftsmanship, a question about the coming harvest, a concern for stored grain, a challenge for travelers, a blessing for some fields and a threat to others, a source of work, worry, relief, inconvenience, and opportunity all at once. The people living in these villages rarely experienced history as dramatic turning points. They did not know which years would later be remembered in chronicles. They did not know which kings would become famous. They did not know which events would someday fill books and documentaries. What they knew was the condition of the road, the sound of water in the ditch, the state of the roof, the health of the livestock, the level of the stream, the promise or danger contained within the clouds overhead. And in many ways, those concerns were not small at all. They were the foundations upon which everything else rested. A kingdom depended on food. Food depended on fields. Fields depended on weather. And weather was experienced first not in palaces or courts, but in places like this village, among ordinary people carrying out ordinary tasks. The closer we look at medieval life, the more another truth emerges. The Middle Ages were neither the endlessly miserable world of popular stereotypes nor the romantic fairy tale of modern fantasy. They were a world of adaptation, a world of skill, a world of limitations, certainly, but also of practical knowledge and resilience. The villagers we have spent time with were not passive figures trapped by their circumstances. They were constantly solving problems, maintaining systems, reading landscapes, helping neighbors, protecting resources, and making countless small decisions that allowed their communities to endure. A rainy day simply made those efforts easier to see. It revealed the hidden labor behind survival, the patched roof, the cleared ditch, the stored firewood, the repaired fence, the careful observation of crops and animals, the conversations exchanged at markets and along muddy roads, all the quiet work that rarely appears in grand historical narratives. And perhaps that is why a rainy day offers such a powerful window into the past. It strips away spectacle.it, brings us closer to lived experience. It reminds us that most people throughout history spent their lives not making history as they understood it, but making life possible. As evening settles once more over the village in our imagination, smoke rises from hearths. Livestock settle into their shelters. Families gather indoors. The roads remain damp. The fields continue absorbing the memory of the rain. Tomorrow will bring new tasks, new concerns, new weather. The cycle continues as it always did. And if there is one detail that perhaps feels hardest for modern people to imagine, it is not the mud, the darkness, or even the uncertainty. It is the intimacy, the closeness between people and the natural world around them. The awareness that every season mattered, that every storm mattered, that every change in weather carried consequences stretching through households, communities, and entire landscapes. For medieval villagers, the environment was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in daily life. Rain was part of that conversation, a conversation that lasted centuries, a conversation carried through generations, a conversation written not only in chronicles and records, but in worn footpaths, repaired roofs, cultivated fields, and the accumulated wisdom of ordinary people. And perhaps the next time you hear rain falling outside your own window, you might briefly think of those villages scattered across the medieval countryside, of the farmers looking toward dark clouds, of the millers watching rising water, of the families gathered around smoky hearths, of the countless lives shaped by weather in ways both visible and hidden. History often feels distant, but sometimes it arrives as quietly as rain. And with that, our long walk through a rainy day in a medieval village comes gently to an end. If there was one detail that surprised you most, or one part of medieval life that felt hardest to imagine living through, that would be a fascinating thing to share. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the everyday realities of the past, I hope you'll join us again for another evening of thoughtful history. Until next time, thank you for listening, and good night.